name is Marianne de Visser. I'm an adult neurologist based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and I'm an emeritus professor of neuromuscular diseases at the University of Amsterdam.
And my name is Maurice Friedman. I'm from Canada. I am from the University of Toronto and Baycrest Health Sciences, and I'm a trustee of the World Federation of Neurology.
My name is Walter Stuhl. I'm professor of neurology in Lower Austria, Tulln, at the University Clinic of Tulln. I'm interested in the autonomic nervous system, and I'm serving as e-communication committee chair for WFN. So may I all welcome you today for today's recap session, a little bit earlier than yesterday. May I ask you, Marianne, what session did you visit today? What impressed you most, and what would you recommend to our audience for post-viewing?
Thank you, Walter. Well, I attended a meeting on outcome measures. I moderated that session, and I was also a speaker in that session. It's not an easy task to develop valid, reliable, responsive outcome measures. I'm sure that does not only hold for neuromuscular diseases, but also for autonomic nervous system diseases and also for behavioral neurology. There were three speakers, one on myopathies, outcome measures in myopathies, and Crystal Kleis mainly discussed the clinical outcome measures. There was Alessandra Ferlini from Ferrara in Italy. Crystal Kleis is from Belgium, and she discussed biochemical and genetic biomarkers in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And I was assigned the task to discuss outcome measures in motor neuron disease and in neuropathies. And as I said, it's not an easy task to develop and validate outcome measures. But there is an urgent need for outcome measures. And let me give you one example. In ALS, for instance, the usual outcome measure in clinical trials is the ALS functional rating scale and survival. But the problem is with the ALS functional rating scale and survival that you need huge sample sizes, about 500 participants in each arm. Whereas there is now a very promising novel biomarker, neurofilament light chain, and if that is used as a pharmacodynamic biomarker in, let's say, phase 2 trials, only 26 patients in each arm are required. So that is a huge difference and would greatly facilitate clinical trials in this devastating disease. So I think that the main message here is that developing outcome measures, but especially validating outcome measures, is key.
Thank you. So that was a very interesting session and is extremely important to review also for everyone doing scientific clinical science. Maurice, may I ask you which sessions did you attend today, and would you like to recommend?
I attended the very excellent teaching course on behavioral neurology chaired by Professor Stefano Capo from Italy. Let me just recap the highlights. Facundo Manis talked about how to make a diagnosis in people with late onset behavioral change. And he focused on behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in adults, and behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia phenocopy. And a key point that he made is the diagnosis, is very important, can often be difficult because patients with behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, at least in the early stages, this disorder is essentially a behavioral disorder, and thus patients often perform well on standard cognitive tests. And in addition, he pointed out that it's important to recognize the phenocopy of behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, because this is a disorder that looks like frontotemporal dementia, but it doesn't progress like this disorder, and it's due to other causes. Then there was a talk by Masood Hussain, who spoke about apathy and empathy in neurodegenerative conditions. And he talked about a very interesting way to conceptualize apathy in terms of whether reward is worth the effort. So basically, patients with apathy have a relative insensitivity to reward. And he also focused on the neuroanatomy of apathy and gave very important information about the key role of frontal striatal systems. And he also discussed the role of dopamine in apathy, with the idea being that reduced dopamine may contribute to apathy, and the dopaminergic medication may improve apathy. And he talked about empathy, including its underlying neuroanatomy, and also about the right temporal variant of behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia. And finally, Jolanda Pijnenberg from Amsterdam spoke about the management of neuropsychiatric symptoms in dementia, and she discussed very important principles of non-pharmacological management of neuropsychiatric symptoms in dementia, such as agitation and hallucinations. And it's key, since many patients with neuropsychiatric symptoms can be treated without drugs. And finally, she mentioned that there are a subset of patients who do need medication, and she discussed the important principles of pharmacological approaches. So I'd highly recommend looking at this session, which I believe is available on demand.
Thank you. Yes, also the discussion had been really challenging and interesting. And I learned a new term there, which is motor chauvinism. That is an interesting term to refer to that we as neurologists, we pick on the motor symptoms, but as you say, the neuropsychiatric syndromes and that kind of phenomenology, we are less eventually acquainted with, but we can measure it less, and therefore we focus more on other signs and symptoms. I haven't heard that term before. Thank you. We had a very interesting presidential symposium today, also with the WFN medals presentation. Had you been visiting those? What had been your impressions, Marianne?
Yeah, it was really a fascinating symposium. Indeed, it first started with bestowing prestigious WFN medals on various people for their educational, scientific achievements or services to WFN. That was a very nice part of the symposium. It started with citations and acceptance speeches. And then there was an interview with Peter Doherty, a Nobel Prize laureate. And he is the recipient of that prize that was bestowed upon him in 1996, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, because of his impact on research on infectious immune defense, the cell-mediated immune defense. And that has a huge impact, in research on infectious diseases, inflammatory disease, and also cancer. But that was 1996, and now in 2021, we saw really a fascinating personality, 80 plus, and who told us that he closed his lab 2 years ago in 2019. And then all of a sudden the pandemic came upon us, and he said he became a junior journalist involved in communication on COVID-19. I mean, it was a very educational session, that interview, but also he's a man with a good sense of humor, so it was also fun. But I leave it to you to share his information on the pandemic and on post-COVID with us.
It's hard to share that kind of information in a one-liner or two-liner, but there were some really interesting facts, and the way he perceived it. Also with long COVID, especially with long COVID, several questions refer to long COVID there. And the discussion he was having on that were right on the spot. That things of it's hard to catch it. It's not well defined. There is autonomics in it, which of course I'm personally very interested in. But eventually, that's kind of a spectrum, and it's joint diagnosis for several entities, if there are entities at all. And we have to learn lots about that. And also his comments on the parallels with the so-called Spanish flu, and this very different situation that we now perfectly know the start. We can define the diagnosis, we can define the syndrome, and we can follow up the patients, and we can learn a lot. And it's also, for me personally, enlightening to see a person like him, a long time in the field, and then he talks about the chances to learn and the many things we can learn, and his open-minded way of dealing with this pandemic, and all the progresses we also make in the medical field. And today there had been a second lecture, which was very interesting as well. This was by Ettore Beghi, and he was referring to some of the data that was published on COVID in the initial phase, and then he drew a comparison to the current data. He is also involved in the energy register of the European Academy, and he had some preliminary data there presented as well. And it was fascinating on the progression we did in not much more than 18 months in a pandemic. So that both sessions I would really warmly recommend to review on demand. For tomorrow, we have another day full of interesting lectures. What are you looking forward to seeing tomorrow?
Walter, do you allow me to say a few words
Yes,
about the presidential address by
please.
President Bill Carroll? He gave a summary on the pandemic and WFN's response. But what I found extremely interesting is the initiative by the WFN, together with all sorts of organizations, including the Global Neurologic Alliance and WHO, on what he called the Brain Health Initiative. And that is not only a campaign, but also includes the WFN Needs Registry. That is a survey about accessibility of drugs. And what he showed, he had some slides showing graphs that there is a huge need of drugs in lower income countries. And I think it's very important that we have that information now. So I'd like to pick that as one of the key messages from our president.
Yes, I really have to say the day today was so full of fascinating lectures, but this was the highlight. I also enjoyed that session very much. It was extremely interesting to learn how WFN adapted in a very short time to this pandemic, completely restructured to address that challenges that are facing neurology worldwide currently. Yeah. Thank you very much for referring to that.
Yeah, and tomorrow I'm going to attend and actually am allowed to moderate a session composed of free communications on neuromuscular diseases. And what I especially like about these free communication is that it gives a platform to early career neurologists and neuroscientists to present their work. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Very good. That's interesting. Very good. Maurice, where will you be going tomorrow? What are you looking forward to seeing tomorrow?
Yes, what looks very interesting is there is a teaching course on controversies in neuropsychiatry and a teaching course in dementia. So I'm going to keep my eye on those two.
Yes, for tomorrow there are very interesting topics on dementia as well, and I personally will also visit several of the lectures, main topic and teaching course tomorrow. So thank you very much for having a recap of this second day of the Congress, and I hope you will have some time to relax, some time to sleep, whatever your time is. And I hope that we will have an as interesting and fascinating day tomorrow as we had today. And for those of you who haven't already taken the photo and sent it for the Rome Congress of the WFN, there's still time to do that. Use the hashtag WCN 2021. Post your photo and you can win something. You can win free attendance of the Congress in 2 years. So that's worth it. I wish you all a very nice day. Thank you very much, Marianne de Visser. Thank you very much, Maurice Friedman, for this very nice talk. Good night.
Thank you.
My pleasure.